I call Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take a call on this, the third reading of the Social Housing Reform, Flexible Purchasing and Remedial Matters Bill. When my colleague Kevin Hague spoke in the first reading on this bill, he said this bill was an emblem of the government's wider housing agenda and evoked the government's own consultation process for the flag referendum distraction. Members will know that New Zealanders in that campaign are asked, "What do you stand for?" and then pose for photos, holding a sign saying what they stand for. Well, with this bill, one can all too easily, I think, imagine the Prime Minister holding his sign, no doubt with a relaxed smile on his face. And the sign might read, "I stand for abdication of government responsibility." Or it might say, "I stand for not giving a damn." Or it might say, "I stand for the ideology of pink and grey, the 80s and 90s, even though that failed miserably the first time round." Or even, "I stand for contempt for the normal democratic process that should surround a bill like this." There is a housing crisis in this country, Mr Speaker. People from Invercargill to Kaitaia are sleeping in cars, in overcrowded housing, and on other people's couches because they can't get into state houses and can't afford private rentals. All but the most privileged young people now are facing a lifetime of renting, of never being able to buy their own home, something that was once considered a birthright for those in this country. This represents growing intergenerational inequality, the abandoned generation. It also represents a demise of community. One of the National Party members last night said that this government, the national government, represents big community. Well, I can tell that member and members on that side of the House that in my community, a low-income community, there is amazing heart and amazing kindness. But it's hard for that to bed in community because sadly, all too often, people are having to move because they're in rental accommodation and they can't afford the costs. So my community is constantly in flux because of the policies of this government, which undermines our entire social fabric. This government's approach undermines community. I was at the Child Poverty Action post-budget breakfast this morning and was really moved by a presentation by a young emergency department doctor talking about the personal shock he had experienced of seeing the emergency department in Wellington turn into what seemed like a paediatric clinic during the cold snap just last month in April. While he was studying, he'd learnt about the social determinants of health in his studies, and he knew that poverty and poor housing are causing illness. About 40,000 preventable hospital admissions a year in this country. He knew, he had learnt through his study, that more than one child a week dies from poverty-related illnesses in this country, many connected to the quality and overcrowding of our housing. He knew all of this theoretically, but he told us that none of that learning prepared him for the reality of facing that onslaught of children in the middle of the night, coming in waves of sickness with bronchial diseases and even pneumonia. And he said that this budget and this legislation will do nothing to stem the flow of children into the emergency departments of this country, and it will do nothing to stop the deaths. And that grieves me. that when this Parliament, this government, had the opportunity to present us with legislation that could have turned that around. What we have instead is legislation that is making it easier for the government to transfer state housing stock into the hands of private developers and possibly some community organisations. Last night, when government members bothered to take their maybe maximum 2-minute calls on this bill, they mention a commitment to home insulation from this government. And I'd like to remind this House that that was a Green Party initiative, an initiative that this government stopped before the job was done. And again, how familiar is that? So the member saying that's not true. Well, I would like to ask that member, is every house in this country insulated? Would every house in this country pass a warrant of fitness? Are our houses still killing our children? The reality is they are still killing our children. You have not finished the job. And now this bill is passing under urgency, without the possibility for the public to contribute to it, except through one media release from the community housing providers who are telling us they believe it's timid and will not solve the problems that we are seeing in the community. This bill is passing without analysis from Treasury or any substantive input and analysis of the implications, particularly the fiscal implications. And it is passing without, I would say, even one coherent, substantive speech from the government to provide detail on this bill so that those of us on this side of the House and in the public of New Zealand can properly engage with what we are doing. And it seems to me at the heart of this bill, it is helping the government transfer state housing stock to property developers. And while the Green Party absolutely supports the role for community housing providers, we believe it needs to be an addition to strong state house sector. And we absolutely oppose the transferring of state housing resources, our collective public resources, into the hands of the private sector to make a profit off the vulnerability of New Zealanders. This government is failing on housing at every turn. The public expects that New Zealanders will not be sleeping on the streets or in cars or garages, but this government has done nothing to address homelessness or provide emergency housing. The public expects that it should be possible for someone to rent a house and feel secure. But this government has presided over skyrocketing rents and making rental tenure less secure. Landlords seem to be in some kind of race to the bottom these days, and in fact where the worst standards have become entrenched. Right now, landlords, including, tragically, Housing New Zealand, who lose their cases in the Tenancy Tribunal, are now using 90-day notices to evict tenants. The public expects that everyone will have a home that is at least healthy, dry and warm. Yet despite the Green Party policy for home insulation, many New Zealanders are still living in houses that are broken, in disrepair and are making them ill. The public expects that that traditional dream of home ownership should still be available to all. Yet the government seems relaxed about a situation in Auckland where the median house price is now around $800,000, while the median household income for people under 35 is $50,000. Younger people in Auckland are being permanently excluded from home ownership, with devastating economic consequences for them personally and for our wider economy into the future. And finally, I do want to remind the National Party that they were actually the first party to build state houses in this country. Yeah. In 1905, Richard Seddon passed the Workers' Dwelling Act to build the first state houses for inner city workers to rent. He thought New Zealanders could enjoy higher standards of living if the state took over from, quote, greedy city landlords. I still believe that's true.
I call Dennis